welcome in particular our honored guest, Professor Abhijit Sen, who is now in a dual role of discussant as well as the chairperson, since the minister may not be able to make it, and Professor Abhijit Banerjee from MIT. Professor Banerjee today will be discussing evaluations and RCTs and their application to public programs. The talk will be followed by remarks by Professor Sen and a brief question and answer session. After that, we'll invite you to join us for tea. I now request Professor Sen. Just before that, I would like to introduce Professor Sen briefly. Professor Sen is a member of the Planning Commission. He has held several teaching positions with several universities, including the University of Sussex, Oxford, Cambridge, and is currently on the executive committees of University of Delhi, IIT, and NCAP. In the past, Professor Sen has been on a number of official committees, including as a chairperson of the High-Level Committee on Long-Term Grain Policy with the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, and a chairman of the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices with the Government of India. Professor Sen has also been an advisor with international organizations such as UNDP, ILO, FAO. Professor Sen has authored more than 30 papers. I now hand over to Professor Sen to take the session forward.
Okay. I still hope Jairam will make an appearance somewhere along the line. But I think the right thing to do is for Abhijit. There are too many Abhijits on the table. There at least one too many. And the correct Abhijit is, I'd sort of request him to sort of give his lecture. And as you all know, he is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT. He is probably nowadays even better known for having founded the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, along with Esther Duflo. And less well known, although I think this matter did come up in a previous lecture in this series, he almost was our chief evaluation, heading our independent evaluation organization. Professor Banerjee is a past president of the Bureau for the Research in the Economic Analysis of Development, a research associate of the NBER, a fellow of the International Research Fellow of the Kiel Institute, and several other institutes as well. He received the Infosys Prize in 2009 for Social Sciences and Economics. He's the author of a number of books, the latest being Poor Economics. And he's speaking to us on learning from evaluation.
Thank you for having me here. This is a sort of topic I keep coming back to, and I think even in Delhi I might have given similar talks several times. So if you feel very bored, you should just. It's not going to improve since I keep saying the same thing. So let's start with, I think, the core question, which is, why do we bother having evaluations? I mean, there's the reason why that's a question, in some sense, is because till, I would say, 20 years ago, economists really didn't evaluate much. I mean, it was people talked about good policies and bad policies, and they mostly derived that from general principles. And those general principles were sometimes based on planning models, sometimes based on free market principles, but some general principle or the other. So the first point I want to make is that I think the interest in evaluations comes out of the fact that theory is a very limited guide to policy. I think theory is very, very important. I'll come back to theory at the end because I think that's the only sort of, it's a core thought that will keep coming back to us. But it's what my view of theory is, that it's extremely useful in telling us what is possible in the world and what's internally coherent, what could happen, what are arguments what are things we should worry about, what should we look out for, where can things go wrong. What it doesn't do is it tells us which of these mechanisms, the many mechanisms that we can imagine, think up, construct, actually work and which ones don't. And that's for two, I think, distinct reasons. One, I think it's sort of necessarily, and this is the nature of theory, that it's based on a particular set of abstractions. So, you have to, there's no theory without a concept. And concepts are necessarily ways of aggregations of reality, which are necessary to even, abstract. The question is, what we don't know is whether those abstractions are the right abstractions, and I'll come back to an example of that. Second, I think theory is always based on some behavioral assumption. You have to sort of use, implicit in the theory is some notion of, this is how people behave, this is how markets behave, this is how institutions behave, and most of these are certainly untested and sometimes untestable. So the combination of those two things means that it's very hard to go from a kind of a theory to an intervention. That's different from saying that theory doesn't tell us anything about what to do. That's not at all true. But what is true is that it's very hard to go to a specific intervention. So here's an example of what's important. So theory, one thing it could tell us is that education is important for growth. Maybe there are certainly theories which say that. Maybe they're true, maybe they're false. Let's assume they're true. Now, the next step in that intellectual inquiry is to say, well, how do you go? So education is important. Now, how do you get education to happen? Well, that's where sort of you look at the kind of the literature in 20 years ago. The literature says, well, it's very important that a lot of people complete primary school. Therefore, you don't make people complete primary school. That's not a lever. That's an outcome. Something happens. You do certain things, and then people complete primary school or not. So you can't. That's not a choice that we have. So what are choices? Well, choices are things like teacher-student ratios, textbooks, school uniforms, school meals. All of these are instruments. And notice the theory said nothing about those. The theory told us nothing about whether school meals are more effective than school uniforms. It just, that granularity is just not a one at which theory operates, because at some level, at that level of granularity, we don't really have, we have no abstract concept that maps into something like a school meal. It's just something that you give people. So in some sense, there's never going to be an answer that comes from theory. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to do evaluations. It could be that we, economists, we've been blamed for many things in the world, rightly more often than not. And certainly we presume to know more than we do, and maybe we in this particular case we are actually, we don't know, but maybe the policy maker knows the answer. So maybe it's the case that, I don't know which of these works, but somebody who runs education knows the answer. So I guess the claim I'm going to make is that that's not true. So here's the picture I'm going to show you. What's this picture? Let me come back to, this is a picture which has been widely criticized because it's sort of lumps a lot of things together, but it tries to do the following exercise. And the exercise, I think, you could do it slightly better or worse, but it's one that I think is meaningful. So you can ask the question, let's take all the ideas that were tried out in the form of randomized control trials. What are randomized control trials? I'll talk a lot about them, so let me just say what they are. They are kind of like the social science equivalent of medical trials, for better or for worse. They are basically attempts to, test policies by randomly assigning them to some people. Randomly means by lottery assigning to some people, and then comparing them with people who didn't get them, or some areas that didn't get them, so that you really don't, there's no systematic difference between people who get these interventions and people who don't, so you can really compare the outcomes. So there's a bunch of randomized control trials in education. These came out of policy policymakers' suggestions over what are sensible ideas. So take the set of quote-unquote sensible ideas, throw them into, now look at the evidence on that. So I'm going to leave out all the ones that didn't work. So leave all of them out. Anything that didn't work, which didn't have a statistically significant effect on years of schooling, I'm going to leave out. So I'm just going to look at things which increase the number of years of schooling successfully. Now, these were ideas that came from policymakers, were successful. And now what I'm going to calculate is, for $100, how many years of schooling do you get? So this is what this picture says, or no, this is the other way around. This is per year of schooling, what's the cost? And what this diagram shows is studies from different countries. You can let's just stick to one country, which is Kenya. There's the green bars, and the green bars, what they're telling you is that the cost per year of extra education induced can be as high as $200 and as low as $2.50. So just within a country, different things that were each successful, proposed by policymakers, can have a difference in the cost of the outcome of a factor of 100 or 50 or something. So you can get the answer wrong. So even policymakers don't seem to know the answer. So we could if I just give you a blind guess on which of these was most effective, I think it would be hard to imagine that we would exactly get to the answer. So I didn't do it here, but I've done it in the past, and people don't usually guess right. It's difficult to guess right. So that's my first point. My first point is that there's no one who actually knows the answer. We need to know the answer at that level of granularity. It's not enough to say education is good. We have to say how to promote education effectively, and does school meals do better or worse than uniforms? At that level, only data can give us the answer, and the answer we get from the data is not something that you could have got by just polling a bunch of policymakers. Let me give you the other point I wanted to make about theory is that the theory is often, just wrong, I guess is the right way to say it, but I'll try and be more polite about it. So there's a large literature on the demand for health goods. Health goods are things like immunization, insecticide-treated bed nets, chlorine, purifying water. The standard economic theory of these things is that, there might well be demand for these things which is not as high as the social incentives would suggest, because there are externalities. Basically, when I protect myself from malaria and I don't get malaria, my neighbor also, then the mosquito dies, and therefore my neighbor doesn't get it. So you might think that these things require some degree of subsidization. On the other hand, people have usually made the point that you should not give things away free. Why don't you want to give them away free? Well, because the usual argument is that people don't value it if you give them free. So you should sell it, but sell it at a positive price. Maybe not the cost price, but some other positive price. That's been, I think, for many, many years. I've been in economics for many years, and that's always been the consensus. Now, here's what the empirical literature started to show. So there was a bunch of studies on different interventions. One was on chlorine, one was on bed nets, two were on bed nets, one was on immunization, couple more on some tests. All of them had the same pattern, which is that a small subsidy had a large positive effect, or a small cost had a large negative effect on demand. People will somehow react a lot when you give them, when you go from zero price to some positive price, people just don't want it. And you go from zero price to a negative price, people seem to want it a lot. And it doesn't seem to matter how big the price is, even a small one is. So for example, immunization, we did an experiment in Rajasthan where in different villages, some villages, mothers were offered dal for getting their children immunized, a bag of dal, small bag of dal for getting their children immunized. That in others, they were just given the assurance that if they were to show up, then they would get their children immunized. And when you look at the effect of that, you get a blank screen. Hopefully, oh my God, it really went away. Okay. I'll tell you the answer. So what happens is that when you people guarantee that whenever you go you can get immunized, the immunization rate is about 17%, the full immunization rate. People still don't get immunized. If you actually offer people a bag of dal every time they get immunized, that goes up to close to 40%. So you get a huge increase. Now, a bag of dal, so imagine that you were not getting your children immunized because you had some deep-seated belief that immunization is bad for them, then a bag of dal should not persuade you to do otherwise. And if you actually thought immunization was good for your child, why didn't you get it done? So that's sort of, there's a certain discomfort with economic theory with this kind of result. But these kinds of results keep coming back. So these are all different studies. All of them find the same kind of thing, which is that they all pose the same question. If you really don't want it, then why would you be affected by a small cut in the price? If you want it, why would you be affected by a small cut in price? But it seems like a small change in price around zero price seems to matter a lot. So here's a study I'm going to emphasize. All these studies on different things: chlorine for water, deworming drugs, smokeless things are good for you. People don't seem to want them despite being good for them. And when you change the price a little bit, the demand collapses or goes up a lot. Now that just doesn't square with economic theory. Now let me take the one example that I think has been studied in, I'm going to elaborate a bit more, is the example of bed nets. So bed nets was, you know what bed nets are. They're in Kenya, this is important because Kenya has a lot of falciparum malaria. These were, I think all the figures have been consumed by PowerPoint. I think it's moving from Mac to back to does these things. However, let me just continue. So basically, the basic question, as I go back to what I was saying, is that maybe people should pay a low price for these bed nets, but they should never pay a zero price, because if you get them with zero price, people don't value them. So so I already told you the first fact, which is that there's a huge reaction. If you raise the price, that was what was in the figure. If you raise the price from basically zero to 1/5 of the market price, so something of the order of $1, you lose basically 60% of the demand. So people really don't want it if you raise the price. Now you could say, that doesn't matter, we shouldn't give it away, because if you give it away to people, they don't value it. So one nice thing about this experiment is that they actually go and check. So because these people were randomly, some people got the free bed nets and some people got the paid bed nets, you could go and check who were using it or not. This sounds a bit intrusive, but in fact, they keep the bed nets up all day. So you don't have to show up in the middle of the night. The bed nets are up all day in the house. So you can go and check. Turns out that, in fact, people who get a free bed net are no less likely to use the bed net. It's not that if you give people things free, they don't value them. They seem to value them. This was another figure that has, oh, wow, one of them showed up. Great, wonderful. So this is the share of, so basically because the price elasticity is so high, if you raise the price from, the price of, the correct price of these bed nets is way higher than 50 shillings. You go from 0 to 40 shillings, that's 40 shillings is still less than $1. The price collapse, the demand collapses from 60% to 20%. Demand collapses from 100% to 20%. And then what happens is that if you look at the people who actually use the bed nets, that's unaffected by, that was in the previous non-visible slide, that's unaffected by the price. So even if you get free, you use it just as likely. So if I give it to you cheaper, just more people use it. There's no reason not to give these things away. This fact was very influential, and it turned out a policy actually shifted. So the policy on bed nets went from being, no, you have to price things, to I think there's a broad agreement that if we can give them away free, then we should. So I think